Hi, my name is Allison Stewart. I am currently student teaching at Westfall Elementary in Malcolm, Nebraska with the second graders, and there are 21 students in the classroom. Today I'll be sharing with you my competency statement. I'll take you through the guiding questions that helped aid me in creating my presentation, and then I will show you artifacts. After that, I will synthesize and reflect on the past and discuss my future with you. My competency statement is, I am competent at promoting movement and choices in the classroom to foster student engagement. And I chose my theme to be theories of learning and their roles in teaching because I wanted to focus on what a difference movement and allowing choices can make when students are learning new materials and reflect on what that looked like as I incorporated it into my own lesson plans. I have two guided questions. The first one is, what motivates students to stay engaged throughout the day? And how does allowing students to make choices encourage them to learn? I also have three artifacts to show how I've moved from incompetent to competent. The first one is a lesson plan for my first practicum in Teach 297A. My second one is materials from a lesson plan I created in Teach 380. And last, I have images from a lesson I taught during my student teaching. My first artifact is the very first lesson plan I ever wrote, and that was in Teach 297A, as I mentioned. And I was at Prescott Elementary in the first grade classroom, and I was teaching a math lesson. And the lesson was over integrating tens and ones. And I remember as I was teaching that, I looked out at all the kids sitting on the rug, and there was no eye contact, there was no learning. I had not gotten those kids engaged at all. And so I looked closer at my lesson plan, and I was going to go through and highlight just the little places where I had incorporated movement, but I couldn't because the only time I incorporated movement at all was the very end of the lesson when they transitioned from the rug back to their desk. So essentially, I tried a sit and get with first graders, and I paid the price. So that takes me on to my second artifact, and that was the very next semester in Teach 380, Health and Wellness with Barbara. And you can start to see I'm becoming more competent as I go through this. So we were to create this portfolio that involved activities and lessons that incorporated movement but still stayed true to a certain subject. And so my assignment was to create a lesson involving movement that revolved around fourth grade social studies. And so a huge standard in fourth grade in Nebraska is Nebraska history. So my lesson is over Nebraska symbols. So each student was given a picture and then a label for the picture. And they were all to stand up at the very beginning of the lesson and walk around the room and find their partner. So the white-tailed deer picture people found the white-tailed deer label. And after that, we all stood in a circle and they got to talk about what their symbol was and what they knew about it. And so that worked great, and it got them up and moving right away. Then they were all to go back to their desk. So all the state all the state flag people went back to their own desks, and they all worked together. And they were given a KWL chart and just a little fact sheet about their symbol. And I started to give them the choice. So they were to read that fact together, and then they were to figure out what part of that sheet they wanted to share with the class and how they wanted to share that. So whether that looked like them sitting at their table and sharing, or standing at their desk, or at the front of the room, they got to have that choice, and everybody was comfortable with the choices that they had made. So as you can see, I'm starting to grow in competency because this was more age appropriate compared to my first grade lesson, because having first graders sit on the rug the entire lesson is just not very reasonable. And so I'm gearing it more towards fourth grade here. And whether this was like an easier lesson for them or not, it's still more age appropriate than what I had done with the first graders. And most importantly, for my theme, I began developing different ways for students to learn. And I started adjusting my teaching to help rather than going by a standard way of delivering a lesson and just hoping that these students would stick with me the whole time. So I was not fully competent yet because even though there was significant growth from that first lesson and it was age appropriate, I was teaching my classmates that were my own age, and I needed that experience in a real classroom in order to be fully competent. Next, we move on to my third artifact, and these are images from a lesson I taught during my student teaching on the adaptations of a toucan during our rainforest unit. And this lesson was taught in the last 45 minutes of the day in the middle of the week. So I knew right away I was gonna have to get them up and moving and ready to go. And so I started off by having them dance to a new rainforest song. It was a guided dance online that I had found. And so right away that sparked their interest, and they were curious as to what our whole lesson was going to be about. And then we moved on to using movement to review the layers of the rainforest. So as you can see in my bottom two pictures here, the bottom of the rainforest, the forest floor, all the kids were sprawled out on the ground. You know, that was the lowest level. And then as we moved up in the layers, they were squatting, standing, and then all the way up. And so I just started calling out layers, you know, the very top, emergent. So they'd be up high, and then right away I'd have them, you know, laying on the ground. So kind of got their blood pumping and got them ready and more engaged in the lesson, just to kind of get things going and get started. So this was a direct connection to my health and wellness class, because although I was incorporating movement, I was still sticking to what my main goal for the lesson was, my objective. And it got them more engaged, even though they were up and doing fun things. It kept them engaged, and it was a learning experience and a good review. So next we moved on. I told them we're going to do a rainforest safari. They were going to find an animal, and we were going to learn about its adaptations. Well, on the forest floor, it's dark, and they knew that. So I shut all the lights off, and I said, okay, everybody get out of their seats and show me your binoculars. So in the top picture, you can see they're holding up their binoculars, and they were to look around the room to try to find an animal that we would learn about its adaptations. And so as they were looking at the back of the room, I flipped on the projector, and a giant toucan came onto the board. And so, you know, they were gasping and so surprised to see that toucan. And so I knew I had them hooked. They were ready for that lesson. So we worked together as a class to go through these different facts about the toucan and what the toucan's adaptations are. And then after that, they were given this paper to fill out using those facts. So typically in past lessons, I would have said, okay, you can draw a picture right here, but you need to write out your answers for the other three categories. Well, I had gotten to know my students in student teaching well enough to know that some of them really love writing, and they like to draw, but a lot of them do not like to write, and they would rather draw their answers. So I said, okay, you can draw your answer here. I just have to know, I have to be able to understand what your answer is. And I did not have any complaints about that worksheet, and everybody was okay with the choice they had made, and it was taken care of, and everybody learned. And so again, giving them those choices that were geared more towards their strengths. After that, they got to fill out sticky notes on the board about what they had learned, and everybody had something to say. So I knew that they had been engaged enough, if not the whole time, to be able to tell me what they learned or what their favorite part of it was. And I think that this lesson worked so well because of how detail-oriented I was. I purposely put every single movement that these kids did in this lesson directly into my lesson plan. So whether that was me saying, okay, show me the forest floor when they were doing movements, I had that exact line written in my lesson plan, because I knew that in order for me to make sure that all of those things happened, I had to have it in there for me to look through and to see to ensure that it would occur. So with all of these artifacts being put into place, I came up with my synthesis, and my synthesis says students are more engaged when movement is a part of the lesson, and they get to make their own choices no matter how small they may be, and that teachers intentionally incorporate movement and choices into their lesson plans to ensure that they occur. When I first started teaching, I think I was scared to give students choices, because I thought that the more choices they got in the classroom, the less control I would have over the class. And it was the exact opposite. The more choices I gave them, the more control I gained and the more classroom management I had. And again, as I mentioned, you have to be detailed. My student teaching supervisor and I talked about this from the very beginning, that you have to put it into your lesson plan to make sure that it happens. Otherwise, you may forget, and you know, the students don't benefit from that at all. And then going off of my theme, just getting to know your students and figuring out how they learn best is so important. And what movement options can they handle, and what choices will be most beneficial for them. So I need to adjust my teaching to fit the needs of my students, rather than hoping they can keep up with the way that I would typically teach. For my reflection, what I have learned is that movement and opportunities for choice in the classroom can increase student engagement. And with that, I've learned that although there are different age groups and classes are different with behaviors and such, overall, this typically works for all ages and all behaviors. You just have to adjust to that class's needs. And again, details. Have it planned, put it in your lesson, execute it, watch the magic work. And then with limitations, not every student is going to want to participate in the movement activity, and some students will not like any of the choices you provide, or they may want the explicit instruction of just one choice. So saying, no, what do you want me to do, rather than making that choice. Especially at a young age, students typically just need that instruction and don't like to have to make their own decisions. And based off those limitations, for the future, I will have to learn how to modify the type of movement and choices I incorporate into my lesson plans based on the needs of my students each year. Again, get to know your class, and the different grade levels. So I've accepted a job as a kindergarten teacher, and so trying to adjust what I've done in second grade all year long to what kindergartners are capable of, and how that will look in that kind of different setting at a younger age. A short-term goal of mine is to take as many professional development classes this summer, and when I can during the school year, in order to keep up to date on things. And whether that is technology, or even classes about movement or choices in the classroom, just making sure that I'm always learning and growing and just being the best educator that I can. And a long-term goal is to get my master's degree and to continue to reach out with former supervisors and cooperating teachers to make sure I always keep those connections and just kind of see what they're doing in their classroom and how I can incorporate that into my own to work for my own class. So just to recap, I've showed you how I grew to be competent over time through 3 different artifacts. The first one was the first lesson plan I ever wrote, and then my materials from my health and wellness class, and last, images from my student teaching. And all of these put together prove that my competency statement, I'm competent at promoting movement and choices in the classroom to foster student engagement, is in fact true. And then we reflected on my past, what I have learned, and how this will impact my future. Do you have any questions?